pleased to have Sara Kazmi with us today. Many of you know Sara because she used to be here with us at Lungs, and also just because she's generally very well known in Lahore. And in this room, in this room and beyond. And we're very, very happy that she's come back from Cambridge, where she's doing her PhD, temporarily to join us in comparative postcolonial literatures. That's a good, yeah, in English, but her presentation today is going to be on postcolonial echoes of Hir, and she's going to be talking about the feminist poetics in the work of the vernacular. Yes, and Sara can tell you a lot more about it than I can. So I'll hand over to you, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Nida and Tanya, for letting me sort of come here and talk about my work, and for Eamon, she's not here right now, but for organizing this. So this is a draft chapter for my PhD, and it would be really great to get some feedback in on it and sort of help develop work. So just going to. Do you think we should have like less slides so can people see the slides? Maybe let's count. How many people know this woman? Or yes, you will. Other than Farouk. So come on. बता दें आप सब.
नहीं आप ही बताएं.
Okay. So this is Nasreen A Bhatti, and I was hoping maybe some people heard about her because last year, or I think the year before that, there was actually quite a bit of hoo-ha, like people were talking about her work was being discussed, and it's really sad, but as someone who works on Punjabi poetry, and I've been reading Punjabi poetry in different sort of study circles for almost 8 years now, this is the first time I heard of her, right? And I first heard of her basically in late 2017, and this is when I was sort of just starting my PhD and agonizing over what text am I going to work on. And I was reading Amrita Pritam at that point, and I was reading her iconic poem, Hir Waris Shah. Today I call on Waris Shah. And I was thinking that she is a canonical figure in many ways, but she hasn't, her work, and particularly this poem, hasn't really received any kind of serious critical attention. And then this whole sort of controversy around Nasreen A Bhatti, I think just made it very clear for me why that might be the case. And what happened is that there was a book published by a writer, Punjabi short story writer called, whose pen name is Nansukh. And this was a sort of collection of short stories called Aaye Bure Diwa, which was a few, I think 3 or 4 maybe short stories, which were biographical and were looking at left-wing progressive activists and intellectuals from the Punjab. So there's a story about Dada Mir Haider in there, and then there's also this one about Nasreen. And immediately, while I've read other, I follow Nansukh's work and I quite enjoy some of it, particularly like his major work, his novel Magazal Hussain, which really demonstrates this kind of openness to exploring queer readings of Shah Hussain. So you would, but when it comes to actually writing about this woman, this left political worker, there really is this kind of complete failure in terms of the Punjabi literary form being able to deal with and work through her life and trying to talk about women's sexuality, women's bodies. And I think that has a lot to do with the very male-dominated kind of nature of the Punjabi literary sphere. So you will go to these panels and these discussions, and there's always, well, we're very feminist because, we have Hir, but it's always a panel of men who are saying that. So there's always that problem, right? And so this is something that has tended to shape literary form and content, and I think it's what, in some ways, kind of has made Punjabi literature, modern Punjabi writing, really struggle with writing about gender, and it's also just stifled those debates around where does progressive writing and literary representation and gender kind of figure, right? So the good thing though was that this short story did spark some kind of a discussion in the literary circles, right, about how does a literary tradition, or how does a particular literary formation, in this case the Punjabi one, deal with gendered experience, or deal with sort of women's bodies and sexuality, right? But again, the debate, and it was interesting to kind of look at it, there was primarily taking place between men, and there were sort of two larger dominant sort of opinions that emerged. And on the one side were people who defended the short story writer and said, well, you know, for the sake of, this is about freedom of creative expression, this is about freeing the aesthetic of Punjabi literature from these kind of confines, and please, you know, they were sort of appealing to this very liberal idea of Punjabi literature should be anything and everything that it wants to be, and it shouldn't be wedded to any kind of radical project or to any kind of sort of Marxist articulation, which has been a very dominant stream within. And on the other side, there were again mostly men who said, how could you say that about Nasreen? She was such a noble and good woman, and she was like a mother. And so there's this complete sort of, you know, then there's this kind of mother-like defense of her honor, as it were, that you can't say these things about her. And, sorry.
For someone like me, there may be others who haven't read the story. Could you just very briefly tell us about the story so that we can...
Oh, sure. I mean, it's just, I don't want to spend too much time because I have a lot to... but it, as a story, it really just looked at the different relationships that she allegedly had with men and with women, and there's a complete sort of strange way in which her, you know, it is just that. I would say it's like sort of a collection of different kinds of gossip about her, and it's not even anonymized. It's with her name. Other people are named in the story. This woman, then she was hanging out with the lefties, with the Surkhas, and she got pregnant, and then she had to move away. It is stuff like that, right? And that's why it really, really hurt people, because she died a few years ago. So it just was this very strange kind of posthumous attack on her character and on her contribution to politics, right? So on the other side, we have this kind of, you know, okay, Nasreen is an honorable, respectable woman, and on the other we have this, no, you know, we can write about her, and it's a very strange position. And what was interesting was that the only kind of radical intervention in this didn't come from within, and it wasn't generated from within the Punjabi literary sphere. It actually came from outside, from a group of people who actually hadn't read Nasreen A Bhatti's work, weren't familiar with her poetics or her poetry, and that was the Feminist Collective, who sort of took it upon themselves to also feature her on one of their posters for the Sham Hisma, which was the kind of event for Women's Day. And this is Hajra Shima's artwork, I think people would know her. And that poem on there is one of Nasreen's poems, right? So this is just sort of, it creates a moment where people are introduced to her work, and this whole new other group of people are like, okay, and they also went to a kind of public gathering for the short story collection, where they actively kind of sabotaged and really disrupted the event in which that book was being launched. And it was very actually really great, because the Punjabi literary sphere doesn't tend to be like this kind of hotbed for, you know, new kind of people entering. So it was that was kind of the radical intervention, right? Which is they called out specifically the very misogynist form of Nensuk storytelling, and why I thought I'd just, you know, bring in the stories to contextualize why these authors are relevant, but also because that intervention, in that activist kind of intervention, raised many questions that Nasreen herself was addressing in her work, right? which, by the way, Nainsook's story didn't engage with her work, it engaged with kind of gossip about her personal life, right? And the question that I'm interested in, and that Nasreen A Bhatti was interested in, and that Amrita, I would argue Amrita Pritam, who hasn't really been read in that way, but also her poetry also really looks at, is how can we construct a kind of feminist poetics of the vernacular, which is equally critical of regional and nationalist patriarchy, so that how can we craft a poetic language which is rooted in the land, but also doesn't reify a distinction between sort of region and nation, between tradition and modernity, and also addresses the silenced margins of a literary tradition, in this case women, because it has been a male-dominant tradition. So all the big ones, the Hir Waris Shahs and the Bule Shahs, it's been a male-dominant, right? So my my work takes its cue from this inquiry. My talk today will outline the legacy of the Hir Waris Shah Kissa, which I will tell you a little bit more about soon, as a genre of contestation and of gender critique. And this I'm going to be exploring through the work of the female Punjabi poets we're looking at, and they're on both sides of the border. So Rita Pritam's obviously in Indian Punjab, and Nasreen A Bhatti from Pakistan. Right? So I will share with you selections from the poetry that I analyzed closely in this chapter, and I will argue that the character of Hir in Waris Shah's Kissa presents us with a decentering of male authorship and a template for reinterpreting tradition, which is sort of a subversive hermeneutics, I could say that, yeah, which is then redeployed in the post-colonial period by Amrita Pritam and by Nasreen A Bhatti. Pritam reworks the poison motif, the idea of vis in Waris Shah's original text, and appropriates the voice of the male poet, Waris Shah, to implicate both regional and nationalist patriarchies in the gendered violence of the partition, and also then to participate in sort of key debates about national culture that preoccupied intellectuals immediately after 1947. 30 years later, Nasreen will weave Hir and Pritam's interpretive maneuvers into her verses to address the authoritarian context of Zia's military regime, in which the Islamist cultural foundations of the state rested enormously on the control of women's bodies. This is accomplished by, again, adopting and appropriating Hir's voice to undertake a feminist revision of the myth of Bhaag Bhari, and that I'll also tell you about. So together, their poems offer us a historiographical and literary reconstruction of cultural identity that places women as subjects and narrators of history. In particular, the questions explored through these radical retellings of Hir address the issues of decolonizing literature and of creating a feminist consciousness which is rooted in histories of resistance. So a poetic voice that critiques the connected patriarchies of the colonizer, of the nation state, and the region or community, religious community. So my own interest in these poets who did not see a distinction between their progressive activism and between their literary pursuit also doesn't stem from just my research interests and my sort of PhD. It's an involvement, I've been involved with a lot of Punjabi street theatre, and that really sort of, that experience pushed me to interrogate more closely the kind of foundations of the Punjabi intellectual formation. And I'm deeply interested in the potential presented by these marginalized regional imaginaries in forming the emancipatory alternatives that many of us seek today. This search resonates with the poetic project of Bhatti and Pritam, who were also very keenly attuned to the linguistic sort of division of and the linguistic stratifications in South Asian society. For them, writing in Punjabi and paying homage to Hir stemmed from an affective attachment to their mother tongue, and also from a political commitment and a political choice that responded to the imperialist marginalization of vernaculars, and also on the other hand, to sort of nationalist critiques of South Asian feminism that viewed the woman question as a kind of Western input that was brought in through the violent process of colonial modernity. In a nutshell, what I'm trying to suggest is that in their reflective turn to Hir, these poets not only, to use Neil Lazarus's words, think with modernity against tradition, but they also think with modernity against modernity, but they also choose to think with tradition against tradition. Right. So to begin, I thought I would just briefly talk about the Hir narrative itself. I'm looking at the Waris Shah's version, which is from the 18th century, which tends to be the most popular. It's in terms of like the oral narrative repertoire, and it's also sort of the most critically acclaimed, and it's directly referenced by both Pritam and Bhatti, right? So just I'm sure a few people would be familiar, but just to put the basic plot out there, which on the surface seems very simple and conventional. So what happens is that Ranjha has a fight with his brothers over like an inheritance-related dispute, and then he leaves Takht Hazara, which is his ancestral home, and with nothing except his flute in hand, right? And so then he just embarks on this journey, which eventually takes him to Jhang, which is where Hir is, and he meets her, and they obviously fall in love immediately at first sight, as usually happens. And then on her suggestion, he joins her father's household as the kind of cowherd, so Chak, right? He becomes a Chak for her father. Eventually, their sort of relationship is discovered, and at that point, Hir's parents marry her off to the very wealthy, powerful clan of the Khedas, right? The ultimate sort of embodiment of evil in the narrative. And Ranjha, again on Hir's suggestion, disguises himself as a jogi and follows her to her in-laws' house in Rangpur, right? And there the two eventually at some point decide to elope. They're by Hir's family through a false promise of marriage, that will get you married off. And then Ranjha sort of returns to Takht Hazara to bring his family and bring the barat and everything, and Hir is poisoned. And then when he finds out about this, he sort of dies of shock, and that's the basic, which sounds really sort of standard in terms of any kind of romantic Bollywood-inspired film. But within this seemingly trite love story, writers of the Punjabi Qissa have managed to enclose a critical ethnography of Punjab and a keen insight into radical subjectivities that can topple the structures of caste, patriarchy, and class. The texts accomplish this through a variety of literary devices, including authorial comment and comedy, irony, characterization. So obviously I'm not going to be able to discuss the entire Qissa, and that's also not relevant to my paper, but what I'm going to do is just focus our attention on one particular passage, an episode, which is the dialogue between Hir and the Qazi, right? So, the Hir-Qazi dialogue can be considered a defining episode in the Hir narrative, and it's featured in all textual and performative versions. The episode occupies a pivotal moment in the story. The love affair between Hir and Ranjha has been discovered, and her parents have vowed to marry her off to Saida, who is a wealthy heir of the Khera clan. The narrative shifts geographically from Jhang to Rangpur, where Hir's in-laws reside, a spatial move that also symbolizes a transformation in the ishq between Hir and Ranjha. From this point on, we encountered a married Hir and a wandering mendicant Ranjha, and the contradiction between love and society sharpens. And there are no further scenes sort of depicting them playing in the grazing commons and in the bele, in the jungle. So this is the point where Hir's dialogue with the Qazi appears in the tale, and it foreshadows this kind of darkening mood that's going to in the narrative, right? And it also in a way represents her final battle against the patriarchy of her father and the inaugural battle of her with the patriarchy of her husband's home, right? So it's at this kind of threshold moment. And it is here, at this moment of critical conjuncture in the text, that Hir provides the Punjabi literary formation with a foundational text of feminist critique. So while Jeevan Deol has argued that Waris Shah presents us with a Hir who speaks from within the bounds of social and literary convention and is a subdued kind of character, I would argue that Hir engages the Qazi in a hermeneutical contest which ultimately leaves his discourse subverted. Deploying verses from the Quran and from traditions surrounding popular spirituality in Punjab, Hir turns the moral legitimacy of his control on its head to force her way into domains of discourse traditionally denied to her. Right. So I'm going to just take us through two stanzas from the dialogue. And this is one from Hir. And I think it reads as, Hir akhdi, jivna bhala soi, jera hove bhi naal iman miya, sabho jag fani, hiko rab baki, hukum kita hai rab rahman miya. I can't read the Arabic, so I'm just gonna, it's Kullish, something something, hukum aaya hai which Quran miya, mere ishq nu janda dhol bashak, law kalam te zimi asman miya. The translation is there if you want to just look at this. So, in the beginning of the dialogue, there's a line where he says, Asa mang dargah thi liya ranjha. Maine dargah se ranjha mang ke liya hai, right? And so, I think it's significant that she uses the word dargah, which is sort of the word that's used to used for a shrine across all the religious traditions. It's not specific to either Sikhism or Islam or Hinduism. And this kind of alerts us to her interpretive method, right? And if you look at this particular stanza, she has the quotation from the Quran, and then she has these references to the Bashik, which is also known as the Vasuki serpent, which is actually a Sanskritic mythological reference to the serpent who was actually used as a rope to churn the oceans into existence at the beginning of the world, right? So, you know, you have the chati and madhani, and you have a rope, and I don't know if everyone knows what I'm talking about, but it's basically, it was literally used to churn the oceans into existence, right? And then she's talking about the dargah, she's talking about the kutub, which are references from popular Sufi, popular Islam, right? So she combines both scriptural Islam and popular spirituality in her interpretive move, and intersperses her words with snatches of Quranic Arabic and references to the dargah and the kutub. These are obviously institutions which are also really abhorred by the Sharia-wielding Qazi, who has his own kind of discourse, and his discourse is entirely focused on the Day of Judgment and fearing the Day of Judgment. And he takes us sort of forward in time, while Hir is taking us back in time to this Bashik serpent, to this kind of originary moment, right? And so in the last line of the stanza, she instrumentalizes tradition to include, and so her instrumentalization of tradition widens to include Sanskritic mythology through the invocation of the Bashik or Vasuki serpent. To the primordiality and creational significance of this great snake, she adds the testimony of the elements, the sky and the earth, so Zimi, Asman, and the Law Kalam, which is directly translates as pen and tablet, but it's also reference to the, I think within the Islamic tradition, the idea of the pen of destiny, which which is a hidden document of all of humanity's deeds since eternity. So, while the Qazi looks ahead to life after death and the Day of Judgment, he takes us back into time to traditions of origin and to the timeless, constant existence of the natural elements. At the same time, though, while the invocation of law kalam reinforces her claim on antiquity and tradition, it also highlights the importance of her own agency, because the pen and the tablet is also, after all, the tool of the thinking, writing human, right? So, thus the idea that here, as many have argued, is this kind of subversive figure who is avoiding conflict with social ideology, and Ranjha is the real subversive figure. They really miss the way she kind of picks and chooses and combines religious and regional tradition in a very eclectic and kind of subversive reading of tradition, right? In a very subversive interpretation. So the second, and this is a kind of method. The reason I'm setting this up is because like Amrita, Pritam, and Nasreen A Bhatti will just plug straight into this method, and they just work this into their own work in their contemporary context, right? The second stanza I wanted to share with you is actually from the Qazi. And this is at a point when there's been a lot of back and forth between the Hir and the Qazi, and eventually he just gives out and he says, Qazi akhya, "Eh je road pakka, Hir jhagdiyan naal na hardi hai. Liao pado nikah, muh band isda, kissa koi fasad guzardi hai. Chhad masjidan, dairiyan vich vardi, chhad bakriyan suriyan chardi hai. Waris Shah, madhani hai Hir jatti, ishq dain da ghyo natardi hai." So he says, she's an unwielding stone, pakka road hai. एक झगड़े नाल ना हारती है, झगड़ों से यानी आर्ग्यूमेंट से इसको नहीं मना सकते. इसका मुंह बांधो, tie her up, so just gag her mouth so that she doesn't say more of what she's saying, and literally he forcibly marries her off, right? And he says, so even though he loses the war of words to Hir, he obviously just prevails through sheer force, and his admission that Hir cannot be defeated in arguments here also kind of hints at a very deep anxiety in the text regarding not just the Qazi and his, the subversion of his agenda, but the kind of displacement of the author, right, and the displacement of Waheed Shah as this character just sort of looms large and threatens to take over the narrative, right? And this is, and in the last line, Waheed Shah acts as a diegetic author, and he steps in here to have the last words, right? So he says, Waheed Shah, madhani hai Hir jatti, ishq bain da ghyo natardi. So Hir churns, loves yogurt to refined ghee. And this is where sort of my little hanging out with my nanny just taught me that ghee is not made that way. First, you churn the milk and you get butter, and then you get the butter, and then the butter is boiled very slowly, and that gives you the ghee. So he clearly just missed a step, and that's significant, right? It's not because Waheed Shah didn't know how, it's because there's a deliberate omission, right? And the second thing is, if you were to churn milk, it would give you yogurt, I believe, which, and then you can't make ghee from it, right? So it's spoiled. So actually it's impossible to make ghee from milk that's been churned, right? So this impossibility of creating the ghyo of ishq, of love, actually hints at a kind of dialogic tension in the text between the author and the character. And Hir's rhetorical power looms large enough to threaten and overwhelm her creator, the poet himself. Encapsulated in Waheed Shah's own concluding remark here, this tension is also relayed to us through the Qazi in another line, who becomes a mouthpiece for this authorial anxiety. So this is another line in which he says, Kheda kare kabul ta khair teri, Waheed Shah ban baithi hai, dhiti hai nahi. So he says, tum Waheed Shah ban gayi ho, dhiti hai, dheet aurat. Are you trying to be Waheed Shah himself? Because you have to accept this man as your husband, right? So it's accept the Kheda as your husband by law and right. You have become Waheed Shah himself, oh stubborn woman, that's the literary translation, right? So And this is where Hir's greatest sort of transgression lies. She's a female character who is obviously indebted to the eloquence and the wit that the Kissa poet that Waris Shah has bestowed on her. But she also threatens to just yank the reins of narrative away from him and appropriate his voice into her own. And this looming and overwhelming quality of Hir's voice becomes a theme and a kind of topos, a method in Punjabi poetry. And you see it again and again in Bulle Shah, you see it in Shah Hussain, you see it in the popular Kafi. And this is a dialogic play in my reading, which is used to impose limits on the authorship and the authorial ego of the male poet. So this kind of decentering of male authorship and the kind of accompanying template that we have for reinterpreting and reworking tradition is then redeployed by someone like Amrita, right? So already a distinguished poet at the young age of 28 in 1947, Amrita Pritam found herself relocating to East Punjab as riots broke out in the wake of an impending partition of the subcontinent. Having made the journey on which countless others perished, the violence and destruction wrought by partition would probe her to write her most well-loved poem, Aaj Aankhain Waris Shah, or Today I Call on Waris Shah. Celebrated across the border in both Punjabs, the poem elicits for many the pangs of nostalgia and the loss of being uprooted from the homeland. However, in my reading, Pritam's poem does not simply bemoan the violence of partition, it also presents a feminist reconstruction of identity to participate in the debate on national culture that engaged intellectuals on both sides of the newly created border in 1947. This is accomplished by an appropriation of Waris Shah's authorial privilege in the sort of tradition of Hir's voice, and by reworking the motif of poison from Waris Shah's original text. So, just for people who don't know a lot about the context, Amrita Pritam's initiation into the Indian literary sphere and her interest in the themes of national reconstruction was shaped heavily, as were all intellectuals of that time, by the progressive writers movement. The PWA, as I'm going to refer to it now, was closely linked to debates over decolonization and the nature of the post-colonial nation-state that was to come into being. So this influence is seen most directly in her 1944 anthology called Lok Peed, which literally means the people's anguish or pain, and which is sort of entirely, there's a bunch of poems in there about the Bengal famine, and it's very, it has a major part of it is criticizing the colonial economy. And the PWA's anti-colonial project resonated deeply with the young Pritam, as did what Priyambada Gopal has called the constitutive role that gender played in the literature produced by her contemporaries, progressive contemporaries. However, writing in the vernaculars, and especially Punjabi, remained a marginal practice in the Progressive Writers Association. Despite the fact that the organization operated regional branches, it garnered most influence in North India, where Urdu dominated as a language of culture. Most leading members of the PWA, even if they were native Punjabi speakers, chose to write in Urdu. This was a choice that was tied to their class. Most of them were urban, middle class Punjabis, and as well as a political commitment to forging a unified national culture. And the imagination was that Urdu is the language around which we can create this kind of national culture. And it's also, as Kamran has argued, that it sort of indicated this shared consensus on the status of Urdu for the North Indian Ashraf elite, despite being on either sides of the ideological spectrum. Right? So Pritam, however, even though a lot of her work was also translated into Hindi, and she would also sort of, as in it didn't happen without her knowledge, but she wrote primarily in Punjabi, and she said, I don't know how to write in any other language because this is my mother language. And in particular, this poem, unlike some of her other works, circulated primarily in its original Punjabi version, and also I think like really interesting the way it was being, she wrote it on a piece of paper and sent it over to her friends in Pakistan, some of whom were already in jail for being sort of critics of the state. And I think that's just another interesting, yeah. So anyway, so as today I call on Waris Shah, Ajakha Waris Shah, indicates to us any literary project of cultural reconstruction in the aftermath of the partition must integrate the questions of regional roots and gender with decolonization. For this, Pritam turns to the motif of the serpent in Hir Waris Shah and to Hir's confrontational mode of reinterpreting tradition. Right. So how Pritam's poem works is by mimicking the form and the structure of the kissa, right? So in the same way that Waris Shah begins his kissa by a description of Takht Hazara and its geography and its landscape, she begins with these descriptions of the land of Punjab, except it is done through the narrative of Hir, so it's a kind of cultural cartography of the region, right, which is constituted through a reference to the narrative and not through the kind of international border or the colonial border, right? And so just as it mimics the form and structure in terms of the opening, another thing that is immediately apparent is her use of the serpent motif, right? And in Hir Waris Shah, there's this kind of, which it has been read, and it is this kind of biblical serpent imagery, because the snake appears again and again. Initially in the first scene, I think, when Ranjha has obviously discovers the kind of hatred his brothers hold for him, so it says, Gujje mene maar ke sap vangu usde kalje nu pe dante ne, that his brothers sting his heart with their words or with their taunts, like a snake. And then the snake reappears when there's a discussion of Keto, who is this kind of village outcast kind of figure, and in some versions he's Hir's uncle, but sort of like this uncle that nobody really likes and everyone's unhappy when he comes over for dinner, sort of like that. And he's the one who discovers their relationship and then takes it to the panchayat and then is very critical in getting Hir married off, and he's referred to as a snake. And then there's this interesting sort of move where the snake, in the scene where Hir is being carried off in her doli, in her palanquin, there's a line in Waris Shah where he says, Sak maadya de kho len dadhe. So the rich take the relations of the oppressed, and then he says, Gun maadya de sabhe ren viche maade moy sab vangu vis khol deni. Wait. Yeah. So he says that the poor or the oppressed, the weak, they are helpless in the face of this taking, and here the kind of allegory is that he is being taken away from Raja, right? So that people can't, they can't do anything, they just watch and they just dissolve poison like a dying snake. And the idea of dissolving poison is that there's this kind of, it comes from a Punjabi idiom, that when a snake is threatened, it will just sort of, yeah, and that's what it is. Vis golna. Vis is the word for poison. So vis golna. So that I translated it as dissolving poison. So when we look at, first this slide, which is from Pritam, right? So she says, Kise ne panja paniya vich ditta zehar rala. Somebody mixed poison into the 5 waters. Ona paniya dharat nu ditta pani la. So it's this kind of heinous transformation of the geography. Right? Is zarkhe zameen de which de lulu phutya Zahir. Veo, and then I've skipped some parts. Veo valesi va phir banman vaggi ja, une har ek vans di vanjali ditti nag bana. So the nag, the snake is here, right? So every flute, which is the reference to Ranja's flute, is transformed into a snake, right? And so this kind of reworking of the poison and the dissolving poison to analyze the carnage and social devastation so she reworks this play on the dissolving poison to analyze the carnage and violence of partition. In her poem, this idea of venom is generalized into ideology, which in this case takes the form of a masculine nationalism that is informed by this kind of communal consciousness. So I Call on Waheed Shah then underlines for us the destructive and interrelated role of colonial complicity, because she's saying, Kisse ne paja, somebody did this, and that somebody has this kind of ominous quality to it, of colonial complicity with nationalist ideology, regional patriarchy, and religious identity, in creating a situation in which ordinary people turn to killing their own neighbors, which is what's happening in the Hir narrative is that the Made, which is the oppressed people, are actually physically carrying off Hir, and then in this whole sort of line, row of caravans of their dowry, which is very elaborate. So there's in the Waheed Shah narrative, there's like 8 stanzas which describe how rich and ostentatious the contents of her dowry are, and then we have this image of the dissolving state, right? So Pritam here then develops the serpent metaphor to give us a powerful image, the powerful image of venom being dissolved into the land itself, spreading through the life-giving flow of the river, which subsequently drenched the earth itself. I'm going to just skip a little bit, and yeah, this is sort of the refrain part, the part that kind of recurs, which is Aaj aakhain Waheed Shah nu kito kabran vichon bol. So today I call on Waheed Shah, speak from beyond the grave, and turn today in the book of age. And that's read primarily as a kind of tribute to Waheed Shah, as a, oh, I wish you were here because someone needs to, like, you know, talk about this. But actually, if you read the last 2 lines, Aaj sabhe kedo ban gaye husan ishq de chor, Aaj kitthon le aiye lab ke Waheed Shah ek hor. Can we find another, where can we find another Waheed Shah? And there's an unmistakable hint of irony in these lines. Where can we find another Waheed Shah to speak the unspeakable truths of partition? Where can we find a man who can give voice to the ordeals of those women? Today I Call on Waheed Shah is itself an answer to the question. So Pritam here appropriates the role of Waheed Shah, a woman taking ownership of the centuries-old tradition of the Hir narrative, which has largely been the domain of male poets. She sets up her feminist revisionist intent from the very outset, as the poem's opening invocation of Waheed Shah can easily be read in the tone of a sharp rebuke, right? Aaj kabran vichon bol, aaj aakhain Waheed Shah nu. So today I call on you, you must speak. You have to rise from your grave. I don't care, you have to do this, right? So this kind of macabre resurrection of the poet, who has penned the most beloved and popular kind of ballad of the land, is an essential, there's no other way around it, given the kind of point of historical conjuncture that is being given. So this resurrection is Pritam's attempt to, in a way, prize away male authorial privilege to fashion a feminist reworking of identity, which has become imperative to the nascent process of nation building. So much like Hir's challenge to the Qazi at the height of crisis in the narrative, a woman must rise to the task of reinterpreting tradition and appropriating the intellectual tools of the male at a time of critical conjuncture or upheaval like in the partition. Right? So I'm going to talk about Nasreen A Bhatti now, who then sort of builds on Amrita Pritam's work and was quite influenced by it and as well. And Farooq knows about her, but she was basically, she was born in 1943, so, and she's writing her book, which is called Neel Karaiyan Neel Kam, which I translated as blue cloth dyed blue, because although there are sort of a few other potential translations in there. So this book, Neel Karaiyan Neel Kam, was published in 1979, and that's almost 30 years after we have Amrita Pritam's sort of invocation, like resurrection of Waheed Shah. And this is in 1979, and this is mere months after Bhutto was being hanged. And there's a poem in there which was very popular and which also was made into a song called Bhutto Di Vaar, in which she's kind of reworking the Vaar genre to talk about Bhutto. So yeah, I think most of us are familiar with the context. This is just the early days, like this is Zia's regime, and control over women's bodies and their participation in the public sphere was sort of the cornerstone of his draconian project of cultural reconstruction, forced through what Rouse Shanaz has called through a perverse mix of regional patriarchy and anti-female tenets in Islam. So in this context, we also obviously have the rise of and the kind of growing consciousness of the women's movement. And Bhatti is very much a figure of this movement, in that she's part of that kind of broad PPP left, and she's very actively involved with a lot of the women's movement groups. So framed by these concerns, Blue Cloth Dyed Blue, or Neel Karaiyan Neel Kam, which is also the title poem that I'm going to look at very briefly, then kind of builds on and develops Amrita Pritam's exploration of this dialogic tension between Waheed Shah and the female. While Pritam used this to open a debate on cultural identity and regional roots through the lens of a gendered poetics, Bhatti uses this to flesh out a historiographical revision of that this entire sort of feminist literary project is going to take. So the probing question posed to Waheed Shah in Pritam's poem, which is Speak, Aaj Kaun Bolega, that in Bhatti's poem actually transforms into this kind of full-blown interrogation of the male lineage of the Punjabi tradition itself. In this imaginative confrontation by Bhatti, we are introduced to a hidden author in Punjabi literary history. And this is Bhaag Bhari, who was sort of Waheed Shah's forgotten muse. So Bhaag Bhari is also like, I'll just have to tell you about that quickly. So she's never directly referenced in Hir Waris Shah, but there's this kind of folk myth / legend that circulates around her figure. And the notion is that she was the lover of Waheed Shah, who couldn't marry, like they couldn't be together, they couldn't get married because Waheed Shah was from a high caste, he was a Sayyid, and she wasn't. And then the story goes that because of that sort of unrequited love, he actually wrote Hir. So in a way, she is that kind of moving force behind the writing of this canonical and text of the Punjabi literary formation. So in Blue Cloth Dyed Blue, Nasreen Anjum Bhatti revives this myth, this figure of Bhaag Bhari, and revives and then places it at the center of the Hir narrative, not as this kind of peripheral folk legend. And Bhaag Bhari is reworked as the kind of moving force behind the creation and the production of Waheed Shah. And this she does by incorporating her persona into her own poem structure. So again, the way that Hir is playing around with voice and there's a dialogic thing going on in the literary text, Bhatti uses that to kind of rework Bhaag Bhari, right? Oh, this is, I'm here, sorry. Yeah, right. So I'm going to keep this, just read out the selection. This is a very long poem, it's 4 pages. I've just done very sort of picked out things which are good for discussing and making it. Bakshi Khaneo ki puchna hai, मेरी हिक ते लिखे ने शजरे, मैं दसा में नूर भरी के भाग भरी, कौन है तेरे वारिस किथे में, पर तू कौन है चोरा, नीनी पाई बैठा है, इलम दा छट्टा पे मारना है, भला हीर कित्थों खड़ीजी ली थी, right? हीर कित्थों खड़ीजी सी, बेलियों के चूचकां दे वेड़ियों, हीर किस दी हिक दा फुट है रांझिया. So hick is chest in Punjabi, right? So the first line where she says Bakshi Khana is the place where it was in, I think in the kind of Mughal period, the military office. So that's also significant, like where the military would kind of get their payments from, and sort of the kind of main office of the cantonment. And so she says, why do you go and ask the military office or the Bakshi Khana, whereas the stories, the shajra, the genealogy is written on my chest, right? And so this is also a very interesting kind of reworking of, it's a referencing of a kind of form within Punjabi qissa writing in which the poet always begins with the declaration of his intent, right? To say, I'm writing this, Waris Shah says, Yara Sanuan Sawal Kita Kissa Hir da Nama Banaiye ji. So my friends came and said, let's make the story of Hir new. Similarly, the Mudar Das, who is another poet of the Kissa genre, says, before he begins his Hir, he says, Akhi Dittha Kissa Kita Main ta guni na koi. He says, Main gun nahi janta. I am not crafting this. I am just telling you what I saw with my own eyes, right? So the Mudar is evoking this kind of act of witnessing, and Waris evokes this kind of renewal, sense of renewal. And what Bhatti does is she invokes this kind of, very embodied and an urge that is rooted quite literally in the chest of the female poet, of the woman, right? Meri hik te likhe ne shajre, the shajre, the tradition is here. So the challenge to the military office, as I already said, is not to be missed. It's an allusion to the military regime and its project of cultural reconstruction and its stifling of marginalized voices, women, workers, religious minorities. And by sort of invoking this peripheral Bhaag Bhari legend where she says, should I tell you if I am Bhaag Bhari? Should I tell you if I actually wrote Hir, or if I was the one who actually kind of was the moving force behind it? She's also critiquing the effacing of women from the public sphere, flattening out vernacular histories in the Islamist nation-state project. And then she just turns straight to Waris Shah and says, who are you? You're a thief. She literally calls him a thief. Where did you get your Hir? Did you get Hir from Chuchak's courtyard? So Chuchak was Hir's father. So there's this kind of, or did you get her from the vast hinterlands, the open spaces? So there's obviously, the house, the home, the patriarchal home versus the kind of generative space, the expanses of the bar. That's also a kind of juxtaposition. Ilam da chatta marna hai, you're just telling us that you're knowledgeable, that you have that kind of trajectory of tradition, but you're a thief. So she's literally calling out also the kind of silences on the creative potential of women, which are kind of worked into any kind of canonical tradition, which are part of the contradictions of the very male lineage of the Punjabi literary formation as well. So while Pritam's poem decentered Waris Shah by holding him to account, Bhatti's masquerade as Bhaag Bhari displaces him entirely. The verses imply that Waris Shah stole his Hir from Bhaag Bhari, a suggestion that is reinforced by Bhatti's play on his name, where she says, "Tere waris, tumhare waris kahan?" Right? Which also means owner and also means guardian. By accusing him of being a thief wielding the weight of his knowledge, she calls into question the ossification of literary tradition into a male lineage of poets. To the Pakistani state's rewriting of history from a communal and patriarchal lens that would confine women to what we have called like the chadar and chardivari, she presents a literary method rooted in the dialogic tension pioneered by Hir and brings to light an alternative history of Punjab and its poetic tradition. She reinterprets and ruptures key moments from the region's cultural history through a constellation of female characters. So then she also brings in the mother of Nasreen A Bhatti, who's this kind of folk rebel figure, and then she brings in Saida from the Mirza Saida narrative. So she brings in this constellation of female characters, and they converge around Bhaag Bhari to establish women as active subjects and reflexive authors of history. So I think I should, we should conclude so that I can hear back from you guys as well. And obviously this is work I'm still doing, so the conclusions are still being fleshed out, but they're just some thoughts, right? Which is, if we look at work on South Asian literatures and South Asian literary tradition, and particularly A.K. Ramanujan, who's a really big literary critic. He sort of discusses the role of what he calls a reflexive intertextuality in Indian literature, which furnishes Indian literature with a common yet creative language of dissent. And he's discussing the kind of Brahminical tradition to the Bhakti, and he's comparing it with the Bhakti tradition, right? And he unites the two in a shared repertoire in which texts mimic, reflect, and critique each other. But he says that modernity disrupted this kind of process of this common and creative language for dissent is completely sort of destroyed by modernity, right? So he says, modernity disrupted the whole tradition of reflexivity with new notions of originality and autonomy of single works, right? But if you look at the way Pritam and Bhatti actually set up a relationship between their poems and the work of Waheed Shah, this idea of literary modernity obviously raises serious questions about it. And similarly, I think Anjum has argued in her work on Piro, who was a 19th century woman poet, that Piro drew on an earlier episteme to tell her own tale, tell a woman's tale, and to kind of stitch legitimacy to her rebellion. And as our sort of very brief analysis of Bhatti's blue cloth dyed blue showed us, that a woman living in postcolonial Pakistan in the 1970s can similarly, even long after the establishment and then the sort of decolonization, right? She was still able to insert her own concerns into the Hir narrative, right? So that then calls for, I think, revisiting how we understand the relationship between literary modernity and what we see as tradition. The second kind of takeaway is about conceiving of this literature as a kind of border literature, and particularly the way that these poets are not really obeying the kind of confines of their own respective nation states, and the Punjab that they evoke and they reference in their work is not Pakistani or Indian. It's the one with all the 5 rivers, and it's also an undivided Punjab, right? And it's not just undivided; it's also at the border in terms of being at a distance from the kind of hegemonic Jat Muslim Sikh articulations of identity. So reading these poets together also allows us to constitute post-colonial Punjabi writing as a broader literature, which lets us look at kind of new modes of South Asian dissent that are organized around literary traditions of critique that occupy sort of marginal imaginaries. And these are obviously at an angle also to the nation state. And the last one, which is, I think it needs the most fleshing out, but and that's the kind of notion of whether we can read them as a framework for a kind of feminist Punjabiyat. And Punjabiyat as a notion has been talked about. Particularly, there's a whole volume that Anjum and Farina did, which is Punjab Reconsidered. And in the introduction, they kind of lay out this notion of Punjabiyat. But to me, it seems that it is quite inadequately theorized. And in the literature, there's this kind of tension between, either we just encounter works that tend to romanticize the notion and see it as an affective attachment to land that overlooks the internal contestations that are presented by the Punjabi cultural formation. Or on the other hand, we have work like Alyssa Ayer's work, in which there's this very simplified reduction of Punjabiyat to an ethno-nationalism, to a kind of search for symbolic capital by the Punjabi elite. But when we read these poets, when we read Bhatti and Pritam, I think we're also kind of pushed to re-theorize these ideas of like how nostalgia or how affective attachment to land can actually create a more oppositional idea of Punjabiyat to take from Said. And I think the attachment to land and the investment in roots that we see in these authors actually comes from a kind of insisting on from a place of insisting on their locatedness, but at the same time, this kind of, it's a very complicated and a resistant habitation of the land of Punjab and its country, right? So it's a kind of position of we'll be talking about it in the workshop, right? So those people know what I'm talking about. But it's, I would say a complicated and a resistant habitation of the landscape, both intellectual and otherwise, of the Punjab. And so I think that this can help us sort of try to begin to theorize ideas of a critical Punjabiyat that seeks to deconstruct hegemonic identity and open new avenues for self-reflection, for the tradition, and for transformation.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Sara. It's especially appropriate because today is our Women's Day in Pakistan, so we're commemorating 36 since their WAF ka jo protest hua tha. Yeah, so today is the, I think, 36th or 37th year since then, so it's appropriate anyway. Like, speaking about, in some ways, related topics.
78, 79.
When they had their protest, 83 men.
83 men.
So I'm going to ask Kamran to moderate the question and answers. I might have to step out in the middle, so do you want to sit down?
No, मैं तो ठीक से
दोबारा सफर करने आया आपने तो बर्डन में सफर करके
every suffer नहीं करने आया कैसी बात तो no, it's lovely. So yeah, anyway, I mean everyone knows Sara. I don't have to go ahead. Ji.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm wondering, I think you touched upon this, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate it further. This question of national culture that takes place after partition. In India, it takes the form of thinking about tradition rather than culture, and it's the same question, I think. But again, both of them are really thinking, and not just here, but everywhere else as well, in the third world, in decolonizing countries. They're thinking about this question of tradition and past, and in practically inventing a tradition for themselves to reimagine a new future. Now, again, it's interesting to see that writers who have regional affiliations are also participating in this conversation. But again, I would just like you to kind of elaborate that a little bit further, just to also make that position a little bit more clearly, and again, also in terms of how are they imagining their tradition.
Okay. So just, I think one problem with the way literature is categorized is that vernacular literature, which is a term I don't particularly like using, but removed from the debates around national culture, and it's not considered, because it's almost as if vernacular writing or regional writing is confined to this kind of locale, right? That it's only, people who write in Punjabi only really care and write about Punjab and its politics, and there's a very kind of, there's a particularism that we ascribe to that body of literature, and we also deny it the ability to engage in concerns that are universalist, right, or that kind of, that are maybe subcontinental in scope or even planetary in scope. So there is this kind of complete exclusion. So even when Pritam has been read, there's this kind of strange bifurcation, right? Because she's not marginal, she's not an author like Nasreen A Bhatti. She is pretty big and she's read, but she's either just seen as a progressive, and then she's kind of just lumped into this very simplified that national culture was about Urdu, and it was about or Hindi, and it was just this kind of modern. And I know that there's a kind of like turn to tradition, but there's also, I think, within the progressive milieu, this kind of commitment to modernity in a certain way. So the idea that we must write in forms like the short story or the novel, and because these are the forms of the nation and not poetry, which Punjabi primarily, the Punjabi writing is poetry. So there is that, and I think what I'm trying to say is that when poets choose to write in Punjabi and they choose to then rework these kinds of quote-unquote pre-colonial, work with these pre-colonial genealogies, it's not a kind of investment in the local as much as it's not just an investment in the local, it's also a comment on the nation. And it's a comment on, okay, what is this going to be? And I would also just say that the other interesting thing within the kind of Punjabi literary radicalism, there's also an anti-nationalism compared to the progressives, who are very committed in the early years especially. They're very committed to a kind of nationalist project. There's also, there's I think more of a kind of critique of nationalism and a critique of the idea of having a national character in the kind of regional formation. So I don't know if I've really responded to your question, but we could do that later. But
yeah,
if you want to just clarify your question.
Oh no, I was just wondering, and perhaps you've not engaged with this question directly, but because this is a question that I'm thinking about. So I mean, again, just this question of culture and tradition, and every question of culture, whether it's in India, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in countries in Africa, they're thinking about creating a new culture in order to create a new consciousness, in order to create a new national subject. And I think that, I mean, I was wondering if, because it's interesting to me, because the writers that you are looking at, their affiliations are not necessarily national. How are they placing themselves within within these kinds of debates of national culture that are taking place both in India and in Pakistan? I mean, how do they situate themselves? That was my first question. And again, through that also, and perhaps both these questions are linked, I mean, what kind of tradition are they imagining for themselves? Because again, this thing is very new at this moment, right? So again, what kind of oppositional kind of tradition are they imagining themselves to be part of? But it's fine. I mean, I know that this is marginal to your.
No, it's not actually probably, and it's obviously something I'll investigate more in. But I think I'm just thinking of like the best way to answer your question. But there's also this in the 1970s, and I can say this more for Nasreen A Bhatti because she's not that Amrita Pritam generation, where there is a larger kind of commitment to an anti-colonial nationalism. So Nasreen A Bhatti is not that generation, right? And in the 70s, there is this kind of anonymously, collectively written text that's produced by the Punjabi literary circles or the Punjabi intelligentsia. And it's written in English, which is also, so that means they're not talking to themselves, they want to talk to other people. And it's sort of called Hamlets Will Hum Again. It's really strange title. So, and then there's a very interesting argument in there, and there's this kind of sort of Gramscian-inspired critique of Urdu and progressive writing, and saying that there's no point in this kind of nationalist project, and you're just doing Urdu to satisfy, quote unquote, satisfy the mores of your own class and your own subject position, and you actually need to go out and to the villages and learn about the traditions of the people, and the people understand and read and write in Punjabi or Sindhi, or so it's this kind of Maoist almost maybe position that I think dominates in the Punjabi radicals that I'm looking at. I'm not looking at the more right-wing Punjabi writers anyway. So in terms of where they stand on national reconstruction, that is mine.
Pritam as well, I mean, I don't say how much he identified with it, but the notion of anti-colonialism is very much there. But for the communists in the 40s, the idea of one nation or 17 is also a problem, right? I mean, how do the whole sort of issue of this Stalinist notion of what a nation is and how. So there's also this confusion about whether it is about sort of British India or it's about various, so I mean, the anti-colonialism is the only thing one can talk about.
And and that's a very different like in Punjab with the kind of Ghadar genealogy is also
And
very
the progressive
different.
really went out and tried to sort of do this folkloric kind of stuff and bring people together.
But it's also, I mean, it's almost like they're obsessed with partition. All the Punjabi writers and the Punjabi literary formation as a whole is just, it's obsessed with partition. And that in itself, like, there's a kind of, I don't know, like a kind of block there in terms of being able to think about national reconstruction in this kind of positive way.
That's a
So
good
I
thing.
feel like all of post-colonial Punjabi literature just responds to partition, even when it's not directly about.
Go ahead, Ijaz.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. It's wonderful. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm starting with a comment which I'm actually developing to like a question in the later part. So I think you've done a wonderful job in kind of performing your methodology by kind of thinking across border, but also kind of dealing with like somebody from there, somebody from here, and also like they are chronologically located in a different kind of setting, and they mobilize tradition, in kind of different ways. So like the tradition remains this kind of a potential reservoir that could be, and this is I guess like one of your point, that it could be used as a feminist or to build a narrative of Punjabi feminism for that matter. And I think the structure of your narrative and the choice of your data, if I can say that, is fascinating and it's wonderful. I want to like push against your idea and your treatment of the motif of snake and poison. Because I'm sure that that in Nasreen A Bhatti, like you kind of resolve this conflict, but with Pritam and with Waris Shah, I think the narrative develops into a kind of in later stages and brings in Jogi, which kind of domesticates the snake in a way, right? So, or Mandris and like the Jogi, they're like out, like living in Tila Jogia, which is like a different place, and then Jogi comes back in as a kind of like a snake itself, right? But also a kind of a snake charmer, and then later on, like with the death of Hir Raja, like the whole story kind of turns into a carnivalesque kind of thing, and it restores the same kind of patriarchal order in the end. So I was just wondering, like, if you're using your motif of snake and poison to kind of to kind of investigate a certain potential, like people are going to push against this idea of like how this potential within the narrative of Hir is kind of like reappropriated through Jogi or through like a restoration of the same order.
Yeah, okay. So how is there a restoration of the patriarchal order? Like, how would you say that?
Because like like
In the sense that they die and there's no,
they
don't get married.
Exactly.
Because that's not patriarchal at all. Okay, yeah, I think that's a very like important point. But so the snake coming back, the snake also morphs into the jogi, and the jogi is Raja. So you're saying that that's why the snake cannot be understood as this kind of simplistic symbol for patriarchal control, because it's used to represent Raja at some point, right? But I mean, actually I think that kind of ties in with the argument which I was trying to make about snake. And what I was trying to say, and I didn't have a lot of time to really like sort of properly maybe flesh it out, but what I was trying to say is that the snake motif is developed throughout the text, throughout the Waheed text, which is an extremely complex and like multivariate text, as I'm sure you know, right? So the snake initially, when we see it as that as Ranja's brother who's trying to grab his land and push him out, is obviously greed, and the kind of he's the snake in paradise, because Takht Hazara is painted as initially as a paradise. And then from there we have the greed, and then we have Kedo, who is obsessed in himself, a kind of suggested that an impotent figure, or a kind of figure that has a troubled relationship with sexuality. And then he's a snake, and then he kind of really controls her. He's the one who physically restrains her and puts her. And so there's a kind of the snake as patriarchal control, as greed, as the rot that kind of is worked into the social relations. And then in the scene I was talking about, there's a few stanzas in which Jahez is carried off, and Waheed Shah takes us through all of it. So he says, you need jewelry and these pots of like amazing, and this kimkhab, and this like amazing listing, which is also his sort of hallmark, right? And then you have this stanza which is called Faryad Ranjha, the cry of Ranjha, ya Ranjha ki Faryad, in which he says कि हमारे relations जो हैं वो जो डाटे हैं powerful वो खो लेते हैं and all we can do is dissolve poison. And the way I understood it is that just before, in the preceding stanzas, the entire village has participated in the carrying off of his, like dowry. They're part of the festivities. These are people who used to like hang out with Hir and Ranjha in the Bela, in the free like expanses. And this includes Hir's friends, who are throughout sort of supporting them, but here everyone's sort of complicit at that point. So I was reading it as, the snake as those individual agents, which is Ranja's brother, or which is, Kedo, is then in that scene sort of transformed into a more generalized complicity, right? And then I think, yes, the Jogi is criticized by Waheed Shah. Waheed is not pro-Jog. Waheed is very critical of, he makes fun of, what's his name, Balnath or Gorakhnath, I don't know. I think it's either, I'll just remember it in a moment. He makes fun of the Jogi, and Ranjha becoming a Jogi is not about accepting Jog, because he says, his teacher says to him, he says, oh, you should be ascetic and you should be, and he's like, I didn't take the joke for this, I took it so I would be with Hir. And he means physically and sexually and in every way. I took the joke to be with a married woman, what are you talking about? So he completely destroys the joke. So even if it appears as a kind of snake, I think the idea of internalizing the kind of Kedo urge, and that's what the snake would be. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Numan, and then you. Numan had
Thank you. So the question hinges on whether I heard you right or not, so let me know. You said about how he was a figure who was helpful in reading tradition against tradition.
Yeah, reading tradition, with tradition against tradition.
Right, so that was really remarkably exemplified in the conversation between Kazi. But was part of the statement also how it might be helpful in reading modernity against modernity?
Yeah, no, I just said basically there's just a very boring grad student thing to do. But Neil Lazarus said we must think with modernity against modernity.
Okay, so I guess
I was saying these guys are doing both.
मुझे लगा कि शायद you were saying
I said I don't want to steal his phrase and just like so.
That he might be helpful in reading with modernity against modernity, but that's not.
That's no, not you. I would say that for maybe Pritam and.
So I guess that may be something. If you have thoughts about that, how Pritam and Bhatti may be interesting or helpful in reading with modernity against modernity, or that's not part of the project yet.
It's not.
So I basically misheard you.
No. No, I think I have to. Yeah, maybe like I'll get back.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fantastic. And I think we have a lot more to talk about, given our brief conversation this morning. But I wanted to there were 2 or 3 things that stuck out to me that I'm trying to organize into one thing. But I'm really fascinated, and I'd love to hear you talk more about how you're thinking through voice and authority and that relationship. And especially when voice and authority is also, especially in the later examples you give, they also mean kind of an authority over a canon and an acceptability to a tradition. So I'm really interested in thinking through like idea of here and the canonical text and what that says about the kind of citational practices of bringing it up in more poems. And I think like, I was sitting here wondering about, and I mean, like not that this needs to be part of your study, but this was just my idle question. Other people refiguring, like male poets refiguring here.
Yep.
And then also the constant refiguring, I mean, Amrita Pritam's poem is in like movies, it's in, like wall murals, so then it gets like appropriated again and again and again. And what that does, like what that citation of Pritam, who's citing Waheed, who's citing like another tradition that's kind of, there's other versions of the Tissa. So for me, I'm just trying to kind of wrap my head around those relationships, but I keep coming back to ideas about like voice and authority and canon and this kind of stuff. It's not a very good question, I'm afraid, but I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about how you're thinking through, particularly voice.
How I'm thinking through voice. I mean, in a very like immediate sort of the immediate kind of response I'm thinking of is that within the kind of Punjabi literary tradition, especially the Kafi form, and I think also just other Indian traditions, like particularly in Realty as well, there's this the use of the female voice by the male poet. It's like a very entrenched form, right? And I think Carla Petrievich has sort of in her book of translations, she calls it a vocal masquerade, right, in which the male poet masquerades as a woman. And in a lot of folk songs, it's usually anonymous, and any woman, it's just anonymous, but sometimes it's specifically he, right? So in a lot of Shao Sen's poetry, he specifically takes on her voice, and there are like references particular episodes from the Kissa, right? So in a way, what these poems are doing are reversing that masculine, right? Because they're taking on Waheed Shah's voice. So usually it's Waheed Shah or the poet the male poet taking the woman's voice, and here's the female poet taking the male's voice and saying, I'm going to be Waheed Shah, I'm going to tell you, right? Which is Amrita Pritam saying that essentially, I will do it, right? This poem is doing that. So in in a way, there's a kind of reversal of the way voice appears in the Punjabi literary tradition. That's going on there. And I don't know, in terms of the reappropriations, yeah, I think like the way it has been, it's mostly kind of being appropriated into these kind of nationalist, quasi-nationalist kind of ambiguous, which is, oh, we're really sad, but now there's a, separate homeland, and there was a sacrifice we had to pay, but it was devastating, and so there's, I think, the kind of reading of it as just a kind of revivalist nostalgia is I think also it's not faithful to the text. It's not. So,
We take a last question or two. Yeah, fellas.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. मेरा जो सवाल था, and is more for myself than for you, कि जो Nasreen की जो आप भट्टी की जो poems आप देख रहे हैं, which are some of the other poems you are looking at, as you were going through your presentation, मुझे इनका बार जो दिमाग में आता है, and somehow मुझे लग रहा है कि तुमने जानबूझ के वो छुपाया, which is जो उसकी poem में पे केड़ा है, which talks about वो snake का reference आ रहा है, वो हिक के ऊपर जो है वो चीज़ का आ रहा है, वो female जो woman है, who's being controlled by the father, by brothers, वो उसका आ रहा है, there is this element of physical जो relationship है, उसका आ रहा है, is there, I mean, and that was, मुझे वो आ रहा था कि बार वो यहाँ पे fit हो रहा है, what was the reason कि उसको नहीं आप true कर रहे?
I think it's from the same anthology, and it's from, I think it's the first or second poem in this one, and this के बाद में आती है. I mean, I just
was it too convenient? लग रहा था क्या था? What was the reason?
in terms of like what it
जो question जो आप डालना चाह रहे हैं, in terms of her asking, who is Waris? So यहाँ पे she's kind of asking who Waris is, but not necessarily in Waris Shah, but who is the person, the ultimate, almost kind of challenging God वाली चीज़ है. वो है ये challenging patriarchy है. Who is the person who is putting all these constraints? Who is the person who is kind of allowing all this stuff? So not only does she question Waris Shah, but वो जो maybe time period का एक historical चीज़ भी वो कह रही कि यहाँ पे ये चीज़ें हो रही हैं, कौन है वो?
But that also happens in this poem. I've not analyzed those bits.
बिल्कुल हो रहा है, but मुझे I don't know, somehow that was something which was when I felt कि यहाँ पे यहाँ भी मुझे लग रहा था कि मुझे वो too perfect a fit जो है वो यहाँ पे लग रहा था, and you were deliberately kind of holding that back कि नहीं, I'm not going to kind of you playing with the reader as well, that okay fine, this is what you want, but so उसको देखना चाहिए आप, and
of course. I mean, I read both the side, I read the whole of the poem. I just, the reason I chose Neel Karai and Neel Ka is because I felt that as a poem, it's a kind of epic proportions ki and this I felt that in terms of the kind of the kind of, she has this stream of consciousness style, that she's shifting between, and she does that in Neel Karai and Neel Ka as well, where she oscillates between Hir and her own self. Me sitting in the courtyard, my mother's calling, like those are so visceral, right? Those, and I know why you feel like, why aren't those in here? Because that's where she's so great, those kind of very visceral, everyday, the home, the father figure, the mother, and those kind of the tension in those. But I think I went with this because I was interested very specifically in the Hir genre being woven in, and I was looking at that in more detail. But if I'm to write a paper that's about Nasreen, I would completely just go.
So fantastic.
Sara, maybe I think Gwen would be a better person to answer this, but just to, I was interested, we can talk about it later, but I was interested in your presentation of Hir. I'm not that even here, the kind of Waris Shah himself not being in control of his voice, in the sense, and I'm thinking of Bhatti and Sora, he works on prose, right? But the issue of pronoun and the way in which there's universalistically, this is happening to he, this is happening, and then all of a sudden he comes and he says, she's as teeth as me, right? And so also the slippage and the way in which the control is also given up, but also the issue of how, the form, in a formal analysis, it becomes a complicated text because the poet himself, in other cases herself, is sort of has to give up certain kinds of, and you, I think, had that in your analysis, and I thought that would be an interesting place to sort of explore in terms of also, because there are all these sort of centrifugal and centrifugal forces, again going back to these kind of argument chronotopes and pronouns and things like that, and one wonders if one forced this text, which you made, into that kind of analysis, perhaps other productive areas of undermining the universalist voice of Waris Shah could come out. I don't know. I'm just wondering, I'm just sort of thinking aloud. I don't know if my friend who's more versed in linguistics would know this.
No, I mean not at all, but I think that's kind of where I was going with my comment about like citationality and canon and those kind of things, well, like similar themes. I think that also that because citing a text also like recreates that text anew every time, which is something you pointed out already. But then it also creates so there's also a creative potential in interpretation, right? So the way the things are reading in context as well.
No, I'm just thinking voice or speech acts, the kind of reported speech and things. I'm just wondering if that would be an area for you to explore, because there are certain ways in which speech acts and the way in which authority is taken over, and especially, and then somehow one could argue that the authority goes away because he gets frustrated and says, right? And that itself is an issue in which the protagonist of his own story is sort of undermining it. And it's not new. It happens in a lot of, and of course in modern novel it's a very well established trope.
But there's like a strategic
and and so one almost gives a kind of life to the text. I'm just playing with it because you have told us to do so. That's all.
But I mean, it's interesting though because this there is a very there's a very real social life to this text because it's essentially a performative text, right? And
in that there are all digressions that the poet can never control.
And the theatre, I mean, we don't the Hir singing is still more popular, but it was a very big part of the theatrical like the Ras Mahalla tradition as well, in which there were characters playing, and the reason that there's a kind of framework for Waris Shah to come in and say his bit is because we had a theatre tradition in which there was a kind of narrator and then there were some characters, and it is the way, I mean, it's almost like written like a play, and you have those characters, so it also isn't maybe.
It comes out in multiple like filmic interpretations and everything as well. Like there was the Gurdasaman one where he actually plays Waris Shah.
ये राम लीला में होता है, सीता जी बहुत चीजें करती हैं, things like that. But just this amazing work. Thank you so much. Actually, I didn't want to end at this very mundane note. But when it's Neil and thing was no. But I'm saying when Neil and all was being invoked, perhaps a person of my generation thought about Robin Neil. I don't know if you know Robin Neil. Robin Neil was a detergent. Robin Neil was a detergent that all of us use, the cheapest detergent. And Neil lagana. There is that thing too that one should not forget. Neil lagana and it's sort of talking about commodified things. So anyway, thank you so much.